What if the man who came to take everything from your family is the only one who realizes they are the ones destroying you? Before we begin, take a breath. This story doesn't rush. It lingers in quiet rooms, between unfinished words, in the spaces where love is found without being spoken. If you are looking for loud arguments or shattered glass, you will not find them here. This is a story about the heavy, silent weight of salvation and the quiet dignity of a life reclaimed from the ashes of a ledger. Before they fell in love, they signed a contract. But long before the ink dried on that heavy parchment, there was the suffocating air of my father's study. The room smelled of stale scotch, desperate sweat, and decaying leather. It was the scent of a dynasty in freefall. I stood perfectly still by the heavy velvet drapes, keeping my spine rigid against the oak wainscoting, watching the architects of my ruin scramble for survival. Choices vanish quickly when you're poor, when your mother is dying, and when your father leaves behind more debt than memories. My father, Arthur, had managed to hollow out an entire legacy over the course of a single decade. He had mortgaged the properties, liquidated the trusts, and gambled away the quiet security my mother had painstakingly built before her passing. Now there was nothing left but the imposing, empty shell of our ancestral home, and a mountain of financial obligations that had finally come due. Pacing across the Persian rug was my brother, Edward. His footsteps were erratic, heavy with the bitter, malicious entitlement of a son who believed the world owed him a fortune simply because he shared a surname with the men who had built it. He chewed on his thumbnail, casting venomous glances toward the center of the room, furious that his inheritance had evaporated into thin air. He did not look at me. In his eyes, I was not a sister. I was merely another depreciating asset, an afterthought in the grand tragedy of his lost wealth. Seated behind my grandfather's massive mahogany desk was the man who had come to collect. Julian Vance did not pace. He did not sweat, and he certainly did not raise his voice. He sat in the high-backed leather chair, with the stillness of winter stone. As the head of a ruthless corporate restructuring firm, the older billionaire specialized in the total liquidation of decaying empires. He was a man accustomed to acquiring broken things and dismantling them for their most valuable parts. Dressed in a sharply tailored charcoal suit that seemed to absorb the dim light of the study, he watched my family unravel with a detached, clinical observation of a scientist studying a doomed ecosystem. Arthur leaned over the desk, his hands trembling as they flattened against the polished wood. His voice was a thin, pathetic rasp, stripped of all the arrogant bluster he usually commanded. He pleaded for an extension. He offered percentages of companies that no longer existed, phantom shares in dead ventures, and empty promises of future returns. He begged with the total lack of dignity that only a truly desperate man could achieve. The liquidator did not blink. He said nothing to the frantic offers. Instead, his large, quiet hands rested on the desk. With slow, deliberate precision, he reached out and adjusted a silver fountain pen that had been left near a stack of foreclosure documents. He pushed the pen a fraction of a millimeter to the left. Then, he adjusted it a fraction of a millimeter to the right, ensuring it sat perfectly parallel to the sharp edge of the mahogany table. He was completely ignoring my father. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy enough to crush the breath from my lungs. Edward stopped pacing. Arthur swallowed hard, the sound loud in the cavernous room. The older man finally looked up from the perfectly aligned pen, but his impenetrable gaze did not settle on the men scrambling for their lives. His focus drifted past them, cutting through the stale air, and landed squarely on me. I did not look away. I refused to shrink. I kept my chin leveled, wrapping my arms around my waist, holding onto my dignity like a physical shield. I knew exactly what I looked like to him. I wore a plain, faded gray dress, devoid of any of the ostentatious luxury my brother still tried to parade. I was the quiet shadow of the house, the unpaid archivist, the invisible daughter who spent her days tending to the overgrown gardens and hoarding the fading memories of a mother who had left us too soon. When Arthur realized where the billionaire's attention had shifted, a dangerous, calculating light sparked in his bloodshot eyes. He turned to me, and then back to the man at the desk, his mind racing to commodify the only asset he had left. With a sickeningly smooth pivot, my father offered my hand. He framed it as an alliance, a merger, a traditional exchange of loyalty for leniency. He spoke of my obedience, my quiet nature, my supposed value as a domestic partner, pitching my life with the exact same frantic cadence he had used to pitch his failing shipping lines minutes earlier. Edward chimed in, eager to sell me off, if it meant keeping his tailored suits and his sports cars. They threw me onto the negotiating table without a second thought, trading my future to save their pride. A profound, sickening cold settled into my bones. I felt the air leave the room, the walls pressing inward, the finality of my own commodification echoing in my ears. I waited for the man at the desk to laugh, to dismiss the absurd, archaic offer, with the corporate cruelty he was famous for. Instead, the liquidator steepled his long fingers beneath his chin, holding my gaze from across the room. He did not smile. There was no triumph in his expression, no predatory gleam, only a heavy, calculating gravity. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, resonant baritone that vibrated through the floorboards, chilling the room instantly. He did not address my father's desperate pitch of an alliance. He stripped the emotion from the room entirely, framing the arrangement with absolute, brutal corporate authority. He stated that there would be no alliance. There would be no shared equity. He would absorb the entirety of the debt, assume full ownership of the properties, and in exchange, the daughter would be transferred to his estate as the final, binding clause of the liquidation. He made it explicitly clear that Arthur and Edward were to walk away with nothing but their freedom from prison, completely severed from his newly acquired assets. My father agreed before I could even draw a breath to object. The contract was placed on the table. The silver pen was uncapped. In less than 3 minutes, my life was signed away in sharp black ink, traded to a stranger to pay for a ruin I did not create. I stood in the shadows, my hands curled into tight fists, wondering how a person could simply cease to belong to herself. By the following afternoon, I was gone. The drive up the coast was a study in absolute silence. I sat in the plush leather passenger seat of his dark sedan, watching the gray, suffocating cityscape dissolve into the rugged, misty expanse of the Pacific Northwest. Rain beat a steady, rhythmic drum against the tinted glass, blurring the towering pines into dark, sweeping brushstrokes. The interior of the car smelled faintly of rich cedar wood and crisp winter air, a sharp, clean contrast to the stale scotch and decay of the home I had just abandoned. He drove himself. There was no chauffeur, no unnecessary display of status. His hands were steady on the steering wheel, his profile illuminated by the pale, muted light filtering through the storm clouds. He did not attempt to force conversation. He did not offer hollow reassurances or attempt to justify the transaction that had taken place the day before. He simply allowed the quiet to exist between us, thick but strangely unburdened. As we navigated the winding coastal roads, the sheer drop of the cliffs plunging into the churning ocean below, I felt entirely unmoored. I had spent my entire life as a shock absorber for my father's failures and my brother's malice, constantly bracing for the next disaster. Now, sitting beside a man who owned entire industries, a man who essentially owned me on paper, I did not know how to hold my body. I stayed perfectly rigid, staring at the condensation pooling at the base of the window, waiting for the inevitable moment when the illusion of peace would shatter. We turned onto a long, sweeping, private drive lined with ancient, towering evergreens. At the end of the road, built directly into the raw stone of the cliffside, sat the Vance estate. It was a staggering architectural marvel of steel, dark stone, and massive panes of glass that reflected the stormy sky and the violent ocean. It looked less like a home, and more like a modern fortress, designed to withstand the end of the world. It was deeply intimidating, radiating the same cold, impenetrable energy as the man sitting beside me. I wondered if I had merely traded one prison of debt for a much more expensive, sterile cage. The car rolled to a smooth stop beneath a heavy concrete portico. The rain was freezing, slicing through the air in sharp, icy sheets. I stepped out into the cold, my thin coat offering no protection against the coastal wind. I moved to the trunk, my movements stiff and automatic, pulling out the single, battered leather suitcase I had brought with me. It contained everything I possessed: a few sensible dresses, a handful of worn sweaters, and the ribbon-bound diaries my mother had left behind. Before I could fully grasp the heavy handle, the massive wooden double doors of the estate swung open. A younger staff member in a neat, dark uniform hurried down the stone steps, an umbrella in one hand. Reaching for my luggage with the other, I recoiled instantly. My fingers clamped down on the worn leather handle with a white-knuckled grip, pulling the suitcase flush against my chest. It was a raw, instinctual trauma response, born from a lifetime in a house where anything I let out of my sight was either sold by my father or destroyed by my brother. I could not let a stranger take the last physical remnants of my life. The young man paused, looking confused, his hand suspended in the freezing rain. I stood frozen on the wet pavement, my heart hammering against my ribs, deeply ashamed of my own flinching panic, but entirely unable to loosen my grip. The sound of a heavy car door closing cut through the noise of the storm. Julian walked around the front of the vehicle. He did not rush, nor did he look annoyed by the delay. He approached the staff member and delivered a sharp, silent shake of his head. The young man immediately stepped back, bowing slightly, and retreated into the dry warmth of the foyer, leaving us alone in the cold downpour. The tall man stepped into my line of sight, blocking the wind. He stood close enough that I could feel the ambient heat radiating from his large frame, close enough that his signature woodsy cologne wrapped around me, masking the metallic smell of the rain. He looked down at my trembling hands, at the defensive way I clutched the battered leather to my chest. He did not sigh. He did not offer a patronizing smile or order me to calm down. Slowly, deliberately, he reached out. His large, scarred hand closed gently over mine. His skin was warm, the calluses on his palm rough against my freezing knuckles. He did not pull. He simply held his hand over mine, waiting in the pouring rain, applying a steady, grounding pressure until the panicked tension in my shoulders began to crack. My fingers slowly uncurled. He took the handle of the small suitcase. It was a jarring, surreal image. A billionaire, a man who commanded boardrooms and dictated the fate of global markets, standing in a freezing coastal storm, personally carrying the scuffed valise of a ruined debtor's daughter. He held the luggage with quiet respect, not rushing me, entirely indifferent to the expensive wool of his suit, darkening with the rain. He gestured toward the open doors, falling into steps beside me as we crossed the threshold into the massive, echoing foyer. The interior of the house was vast, constructed of polished slate and cold marble, yet it did not feel oppressive. The air was warm, carrying the faint, comforting scent of wood smoke and peppermint. Standing near the grand staircase was a woman in her late 50s, wearing soft, practical clothing rather than a stiff uniform. She had kind, observant eyes and a demeanor that radiated quiet competence. "Clara," the deep voice beside me rumbled, breaking the silence of the massive hall. "This is Martha Gable. She manages the estate. If you require anything, you ask her." Martha offered a warm, respectful nod. She did not look at me with pity, nor did she eye my damp, faded coat with judgment. "Welcome, ma'am. I'll have a pot of hot tea sent up to your rooms shortly. You must be frozen through." She quietly excused herself, melting away into the sprawling corridors, leaving us standing alone in the grand entrance. As the familiar fragrance of crisp timber slowly settled in the empty hall, my mind raced to process the mechanics of my new reality. I braced myself for the rules, the demands, the outline of exactly what was expected of me, now that the transaction was complete and we were alone in his territory. I waited for the heavy hand of ownership to fall. He set my battered suitcase down at the foot of the sweeping staircase. "The east wing is yours," he said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the quiet space. "You have your own rooms, your own library, and access to the grounds. The staff will not disturb you unless you call for them." I finally looked up, meeting his shadowed, guarded eyes. I searched for the catch, the hidden clause in this strange, sterile arrangement. "And what are my duties?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, raw from a day of silent endurance. "What is it you expect me to do here?" He stood absolutely motionless, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the marble. He looked at my pale, exhausted face, at the way I was still bracing myself against an invisible attack. The hard lines of his jaw softened, just a fraction. "I expect nothing," he replied, the words landing with a heavy, irrefutable finality. "Your father's debts are liquidated. Your brother's access is permanently severed. You are safe here. They cannot reach you." He did not wait for my gratitude, nor did he linger to watch the disbelief wash over my face. He turned and walked down a long corridor toward a set of heavy oak doors, leaving me standing at the base of the stairs. I stood alone in the quiet warmth of the massive foyer, listening to the muffled sound of the storm beating against the shatterproof panes. For the first time in my entire life, nobody was shouting. Nobody was demanding anything of me. I looked at my scuffed luggage, sitting on the pristine marble floor, and as the quiet finally settled, I took my first true, unburdened breath. The morning after my arrival, the estate was wrapped in a thick, heavy fog that muted the violent crashing of the ocean below. I woke up in a bed that was too large, in a room that was too quiet. For hours I simply lay there, staring at the high, vaulted ceiling, waiting for the familiar, panicked shouting of my father or the sharp, cruel demands of my brother. None came. The silence of the East Wing was absolute. It was not a punitive, withholding silence, the kind my family used as a weapon, but a protective one. It was a fortress of quiet, isolating me from the chaos I had known my entire life. Still, the deep, agonizing shame of the transaction clung to my skin like a damp layer of frost. I had been traded. I was a human ledger entry, a balanced book, a piece of collateral handed over to satisfy debt I did not incur. The sheer weight of that reality made it entirely impossible to remain still. I dressed in a simple, faded wool sweater and made my way through the cavernous, shadowy halls, seeking the one place that had always offered me a semblance of control. The Vance Estate's kitchen was a sprawling marvel of brushed steel and cold, white marble. It looked less like a place of nourishment and more like a sterile, clinical laboratory, devoid of any domestic warmth, save for one distinct feature. Built directly into the far wall was a massive, rustic stone kitchen hearth. It was an architectural anomaly, an old-world anchor in a sea of modern corporate efficiency, its blackened bricks promising a heat that the rest of the house lacked. When I stepped over the threshold, my breath caught in my throat. I stopped frozen in place. There, resting precisely on the center of the sprawling central counter, was a display that made my chest tighten. Heavy linen sacks of heirloom flour, large glass jars of coarse sea salt, bottles of pure vanilla, and bundles of fragrant, dried lavender. Beside them sat a gleaming copper mixing bowl and a set of heavy wooden spoons, laid out with surgical precision. Martha Gable was quietly wiping down the far counter with a damp cloth. She did not look up immediately, allowing me a long, uninterrupted moment to process the sights. Mr. Vance left instructions, the housekeeper said softly, her voice blending with the quiet, melodic hum of the refrigeration units. He noted the flour on your coat yesterday. He assumed you might prefer to have your own supplies. If there is anything else you require, you have only to write it down on the notepad by the sink. I stepped forward, my hands trembling slightly as I reached out to touch the rough, tactile canvas of the flour sack. He had noticed. In the midst of a brutal, high-stakes corporate foreclosure, while Arthur and Edward were screaming about percentages, phantom shares, and their wounded pride, the cold liquidator had noticed a faint dusting of flour on my sleeve. I did not thank her. I could not find my voice. Instead, I walked to the sink and washed my hands, letting the scalding water run over my wrists to thaw the lingering frost in my bones. I moved back to the counter and opened the flour. The scent of milled wheat rose into the air, dusty, earthy, and profoundly familiar. I began to measure. I did not use cups or digital scales. I relied entirely on the muscle memory of 1,000 quiet mornings spent hiding from my family's chaotic destruction. Warm water, flour, a precise pinch of salt. I began to mix a lavender sourdough starter in a heavy glass jar, intending to nurture the wild yeast until it bubbled with life. It was a slow, deliberate, ancient process. Some places don't wait to be found. They call to you in silence. This kitchen, with its freezing marble and its weight and blackened fireplace, had called to me, offering a blank slate where my past could not dictate my worth. The act of baking is an exercise in absolute faith. You combine dormant lifeless powder with water and time, and you trust that the invisible elements in the air will breathe life into the mixture. In a house where every interaction had previously been defined by a legally binding contract, this quiet, organic growth was a revelation. I would stand by the ancient brick hearth, watching the embers crackle and spit, realizing that the very act of creating something warm in a house built of cold stone was a quiet rebellion. My family had sold me because they believed I was hollow, a compliant ghost who would simply fade into a billionaire's background, causing no friction. But with every loaf I baked, I was reclaiming the physical space. I was declaring that I existed, that my hands had value, and that my quiet nature was not a symptom of weakness, but a deep reservoir of resilience. Once the starter was fed and set aside on the counter, I turned to the remaining ingredients. I needed to work with my hands. I needed the physical, tactile resistance of dough to push back against the overwhelming, suffocating sense of displacement. I mixed a much larger batch, adding cinnamon and dark brown sugar, leaning my entire body weight into the counter as I began to knead. Push, fold, turn. Push, fold, turn. The rhythm was hypnotic. With every heavy press of my palms into the elastic dough, I forced out the lingering echoes of my father's pathetic bargaining. I forced out the memory of the silver fountain pen, signing my life away to a stranger. I worked the dough until my shoulders burned, until a fine mist of flour dusted the pristine black marble, until my erratic breathing slowed, and perfectly aligned with the steady, quiet beat of the rain against the tall glass windows. For weeks, this routine became my sanctuary. Every morning, I would wake before dawn, leaving the silent isolation of the East Wing to descend into the kitchen, and every single morning, I would find something new waiting for me on the counter. A jar of rare, dark honey, a bundle of fresh, fragrant rosemary, a small, carefully wrapped package of imported cinnamon sticks. Julian never handed these things to me himself. He was a phantom in his own home, leaving before the pale sun rose and returning long after it set, but his presence was undeniable. It was in the precise, deliberate selection of ingredients. I kept waiting for the trap. I kept waiting for the invoice. I constantly anticipated the moment he would demand his due, bracing myself for the inevitable collection on his investment. If Arthur Finch gave you a gift, it was a bribe. If Edward gave you a compliment, it was a threat. But the demand never came. Julian was merely watching my silent healing, not asking for gratitude, not enforcing his ownership, just providing the quiet tools for my reconstruction and stepping back into the shadows. Gradually, the cold, sterile air of the mansion began to change. The heavy scent of rising yeast, roasted lavender, and warm cinnamon drifted through the cavernous hallways, softening the sharp, intimidating edges of the steel and glass. The glow of the crackling fire was lit every morning, casting a warm, flickering amber light across the marble, turning the room into a beating heart within the winter fortress. I found my grounding in the flour on my hands. I was no longer just a liquidated asset. I was the woman who made the bread rise. Our first true interaction since the day I arrived happened deep in the middle of a freezing, wind-battered night. I could not sleep. The storm outside was violently lashing against the reinforced glass, tearing at the ancient evergreens with a ferocity that rattled my nerves. The noise reminded me too much of the volatile shouting matches at the Finch estate. Seeking the only comfort I knew, I wrapped a thick woolen shawl over my sleepwear and padded barefoot down the long, shadowed corridors toward the kitchen, intending to check on the starter. When I pushed open the heavy swinging door, I froze. Julian Vance was sitting at the stone island. The ambient glow of the rustic fireplace cast long, flickering shadows across his face, highlighting the deep exhaustion etched into his features. His corporate armor was partially dismantled. The bespoke dark jacket was draped carelessly over a stool, and the sleeves of his crisp white shirt were rolled up to the elbows, revealing heavily corded forearms and a constellation of pale, faded scars. He did not look like a ruthless corporate liquidator in that moment. Stripped of his tailored armor, he looked like a man who carried the heavy, suffocating weight of the world, and had finally found a quiet place to set it down. On the pristine countertop in front of him sat a fresh, rustic loaf of my lavender and honey bread, which I had baked earlier that afternoon. Beside it was a bone china plate. Julian was holding a heavy silver knife and fork, methodically and clinically attempting to slice a piece of the crusty artisan loaf. The juxtaposition was jarring. Here was a man accustomed to absolute control, applying formal, rigid dining etiquette to a simple, uneven hand-kneaded bread. He paused as I stepped into the dim light, the silver knife hovering over the crust. His impenetrable stare locked onto mine, unreadable, offering no apology for his presence in my sanctuary. The tension of the unsaid hung heavily in the warm air, thick with the comforting scent of yeast and wood smoke. I did not retreat back into the shadows. I pulled the woolen shawl tighter around my shoulders and walked slowly toward the island. I bypassed the opposite side of the counter, refusing to place a physical barrier between us, and stepped directly into his space, standing inches from his chair. I did not speak. I simply reached out, my fingers brushing past the cold silver cutlery he gripped so tightly. I placed my bare hands on the rustic loaf, applying a gentle, steady pressure. I tore a warm, uneven piece of the bread free. The thick crust crackled loudly in the quiet room, releasing a fresh plume of steam and the sweet, earthy scent of lavender. I set the torn piece directly onto his pristine china plate. "It isn't meant to be cut with silver," I whispered, my voice sounding incredibly fragile in the vast kitchen. "It's meant to be broken, with your hands." Julian stared at the torn piece of bread for a long, heavy moment. The muscles in his jaw flexed. Slowly, he set the silver knife and fork down on the marble. He did not say a word as he reached out with his large, scarred hands, picking up the bread exactly as I had instructed. He took a bite, chewing thoughtfully, his eyes never leaving my face. The absolute surrender of his rigid formality was a tiny, profound act of shared vulnerability. It was a silent admission that in this specific room, under the warm glow of the stone hearth, the rules of his corporate empire did not apply. "You don't sleep," he observed quietly, his gravelly murmur rumbling beneath the sound of the storm outside. "Neither do you," I replied, crossing my arms defensively, suddenly hyper-aware of the physical proximity between us. "I have failing empires to dismantle and restructure," he said, taking another slow bite of the bread. "What is your excuse, Clara?" I looked away, focusing on the bubbling glass jar of my sourdough starter. "I have bread to rise, and the storm is loud." Julian stopped eating. He set the bread down, leaning forward slightly, bringing the faint, crisp aroma of evergreen bark closer to me. The usual stoic detachment that masked his face vanished, replaced by something much darker and far more intense. "The walls in the east wing are thick," he began, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly register that commanded my absolute attention. "But the ventilation shafts carry sound if you know how to listen. On your third night here, I sat in my study, and I listened. My breath hitched. A fresh wave of heat rushed to my cheeks. On the third night, the reality of my complete isolation had crashed over me, and I had wept into my pillow for hours, mourning my mother, mourning my lost agency, mourning the fact that my father had sold me for a clean ledger. I had thought the massive estate was a tomb, swallowing my grief whole. I heard you cry. I didn't like it." He delivered the words not with pity, not with a patronizing need to comfort, but with a low, heavy, irrefutable finality. It was a statement of quiet, fiercely protective anger. He was not annoyed by the sound of my weakness. He was enraged that I had been given a reason to weep in the very first place. "You were mourning the life they stole from you," Julian continued, his gaze pinning me in place. "You are allowed to grieve, Clara. But you will not hide it from me, and you will not waste another tear on men who viewed your loyalty as a liquid asset." I stared at him, the defensive walls I had spent a lifetime building suddenly feeling entirely inadequate against his quiet, piercing observation. "Why did you agree to it?" I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it. "Arthur's debts were massive. You could have easily seized the Finch estate. You could have left us with nothing. Why take me? What value do I possess to a man who liquidates companies?" Julian Vance looked at flour-dusted hands, at my worn sweater, at the rigid, proud tilt of my chin. He did not offer a grand, melodramatic declaration. He did not claim it was destiny. He simply reached out, his warm, calloused knuckles lightly brushing against the edge of the flour sack on the counter, inches from my fingers. "A good liquidator knows how to accurately appraise value," he said softly, the silence of the room amplifying the weight of his words. "Arthur Finch offered me a portfolio of worthless, decaying assets, but in the corner of his study, I saw the only thing in his entire ruined empire that was actually worth keeping." My heart hammered a frantic, uneven rhythm against my ribs. The cold, untouchable billionaire was not holding me as a captive pawn. He was a stoic, trauma-walled protector who had recognized my worth precisely when my own blood had deemed me entirely worthless. He did not touch me. He did not push the boundary any further. He simply finished the piece of bread, offered a slight, respectful nod, and picked up his suit jacket. As he walked out of the kitchen, leaving me alone with the comforting glow of the dying embers, the icy deluge outside no longer sounded like a threat. It sounded like a boundary, keeping the rest of the world out. The illusion of safety is an incredibly fragile thing. By the end of my first month at the coastal estate, the violent winter storms had settled into a deep, freezing stillness. The world outside the heavy window panes of the mansion was a pale, breathless gray, burying the towering pines in heavy undisturbed snowdrifts. Inside, the quiet routine of measuring flour, feeling the ambient warmth of the open flames, and watching the slow rise of dough had become a sturdy wall against the memories of my past. I had almost allowed myself to believe that the solid wooden barriers of the East Wing could keep the ghosts of the Finch estate permanently locked out. I had almost forgotten that desperate men do not simply fade away when their ledgers are closed. That fragile illusion shattered on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. I was in the small, private library adjacent to the kitchen, running a dry cloth over the spines of antique botanical encyclopedias, enjoying the faint, dusty scent of old paper. The heavy brass telephone, resting on the mahogany desk, suddenly rang. It was a sharp, jarring trill that cut through the utter quiet of the house like a physical blow. The private line was rarely used. Julian communicated through his encrypted mobile devices, and the estate staff had their own internal intercoms. I stared at the brass receiver for 3 long rings, a cold instinctual dread pooling in the pit of my stomach. Slowly, I reached out and lifted the heavy handset to my ear. There was a brief hiss of static, followed by the unmistakable sound of a lighter flicking open. Then came the voice. It was not the panicked, frantic shouting I had last heard in my father's study. It was a low, slippery, malicious drawl, dripping with the bitter entitlement of a man who believed he had finally found a winning hand. Edward did not bother with a greeting. He simply asked if the cold, sterile air of the Vance estate was to my liking, his tone laced with a mocking edge that immediately made my skin crawl. I did not speak. I held the receiver with a white-knuckled grip, refusing to give my brother the satisfaction of hearing the tremor in my breath. My silence only seemed to amuse him. He chuckled, a dry, hollow sound that echoed through the earpiece. Before he casually dropped the leverage, he had been meticulously calculating for weeks. In my desperate, 10-minute rush to pack my life into a single battered suitcase and leave the Finch estate, I had been forced to abandon the one thing of true value I possessed. Hidden beneath a loose, warped floorboard in my childhood bedroom were 4 velvet-bound notebooks. They were faded emerald and deep navy, filled with the raw, erratic handwriting of my late mother. For years, I had hoarded them as a private sanctuary, reading her quiet observations, to feel close to the woman who had slipped away too soon. But Edward had found them, and Edward had read them. He spoke with agonizing slowness, detailing the contents of the second emerald notebook. My mother had not just recorded her grief. She had documented Arthur's early, desperate frauds. She had written down quite illegal maneuvers, the corporate espionage, and the toxic financial structures my father had built before the bankruptcy completely consumed him. The threat was executed with surgical cruelty. Edward did not want his ruined inheritance back. He wanted a new one. He coldly informed me that unless a massive, untraceable offshore financial transfer was initiated by the end of the week, he would leak the Velvet Diaries to the financial press. He would twist my mother's raw, fearful words to construct a narrative, claiming that Julian Vance was fully aware of the historical fraud, that the liquidation was a cover-up, and that my sudden transfer to the coastal estate was a bribe to bury the evidence. It was a complete fabrication, a ruinous lie born of sheer malice, but in the volatile world of high-stakes corporate equity, the mere accusation of historical corruption would be enough to tank Vance Holdings' pristine stock and drag Julian's name through the mud. My brother named a sum that made the room spin, 10 million, a final paralyzing extortion to secure his silence. He told me to use my new influence to arrange the payment, suggesting that a quiet, Obedient bride should have no trouble convincing her wealthy keeper to open his vault. I hung up the phone without saying a single word. The brass receiver hit the cradle with a heavy, final clatter. The walls of the library seemed to press inward, the shelves of antique books blurring into a dark, suffocating tunnel. The deep, agonizing shame that I had managed to push away over the last month rushed back with the force of a tidal wave. I was a liability. I was not a quiet, healing presence in this house. I was a Trojan horse, bringing the toxic, decaying ruin of the Finch legacy directly into the sanctuary of the man who had shielded me. I stumbled out of the library, my chest tight, my lungs fighting for air. I needed to move. I needed the physical, tactile resistance of my daily routine to push back against the panic. I hurried down the shadowed corridor and pushed through the swinging doors into the massive marble-clad kitchen. The stone hearth was unlit, the air cool and sterile. Resting on the kitchen workspace was the heavy glass jar containing my lavender sourdough starter, bubbling quietly, a fragile piece of life I had nurtured from nothing. I walked to the marble counter, my vision narrowing. I reached for the jar, intending to feed it, intending to lose myself in the simple ancient mechanics of water and flour. But the cold sweat on my palms made my grip entirely unreliable. The violent tremor that started in my chest traveled down my arms, shaking my wrists so fiercely that my fingers could not secure a hold on the smooth glass. The heavy jar slipped from my grasp. It hit the pristine black marble floor with a deafening, shattering crash. Thick glass exploded outward, raining sharp, glittering shards across the tiles. The starter, carrying the sweet, earthy scent of roasted lavender and sour yeast, spilled into a thick, ruined puddle amid the wreckage. Weeks of careful, quiet nurturing were destroyed in a single second. I dropped to my knees. I did not cry out. I did not weep. I functioned on pure, blind panic, terrified that I was ruining this perfect, ordered house, just as my family ruined everything they touched. I reached out with my bare hands, frantically trying to scoop the thick, sticky dough and the broken glass into a pile, desperate to erase the evidence of my failure. The sharp edge of a shattered crescent sliced deep into the pad of my index finger. A bright, startling drop of crimson blood fell onto the white flour dusting the floor. I froze, my bleeding hand suspended over the ruined glass. Julian was standing in the doorway. He was dressed in a dark, impeccably tailored suit, having returned early from his corporate offices in the city. The cold air of the winter storm still clung to his heavy wool overcoat. He did not look at the shattered jar. He did not look at the sticky mess ruining his immaculate floor. His dark, unreadable eyes were locked entirely on the bright drop of blood welling on my finger. He walked forward, his expensive leather shoes crunching over the broken glass without a moment of hesitation. He did not yell. He did not express an ounce of frustration over the destruction of his property. He simply knelt onto the hard marble, towering over my trembling frame, and gently wrapped his large, warm hand around my bleeding wrist. He applied a steady, grounding pressure, physically stopping my frantic, self-destructive movements. The smell of frost and rich cedar wrapped around me, cutting through the overwhelming smell of sour yeast. We stayed like that for a long, heavy moment. He waited until my jagged breathing began to match the slow, steady rhythm of his own chest. He reached into his coat pocket, retrieved a pristine white linen handkerchief, and carefully wrapped it around my cut finger, binding the wound with quiet, methodical precision. I tried to pull away, deeply ashamed of my unraveling. I told him I had simply dropped the jar. I told him my hands were clumsy from the cold, stringing together hollow excuses to hide the catastrophic threat looming over his company. Julian tied the final knot in the linen cloth. He did not let go of my hand. He tilted his head slightly, his gaze piercing straight through the fragile armor of my lies. He knew the exact acoustics of his fortress. He knew the rhythms of my isolation. He asked a single quiet question that carried the irrefutable weight of absolute authority. He asked who had called the private line. I closed my eyes, the last of my defenses crumbling into ash. I could not lie to the man kneeling in the broken glass to bandage my hand. In a hollow, defeated whisper, I told him everything. I told him about the hidden floorboard, the velvet covers, the erratic handwriting of a dying woman, and the $10 million extortion that was currently aimed directly at the heart of Vance Holdings. I braced myself for his anger, for the cold corporate calculation that would surely dictate he sever ties with a woman who brought such ruinous liabilities into his life. Julian Vance did not flinch. The hard lines of his jaw tightened, the muscles flexing beneath his skin as a terrifying, glacial calm settled over his features. He did not release my hand. He simply stood up, pulling me gently to my feet, guiding me safely away from the shattered glass. He told me to go upstairs, to wash the flour from my face, and to rest, he stated, with a low, vibrating certainty that left absolutely no room for debate, that the issue was already resolved. Then, he turned and walked out of the kitchen, retrieving his encrypted mobile device from his pocket, before the swinging doors even closed behind him. The waiting was a unique kind of agony. I spent the next 24 hours trapped in the quiet suspension of the East Wing, listening to the muffled howl of the coastal wind, entirely blind to the corporate warfare being waged on my behalf. Julian did not return that night. The estate staff moved with hushed, efficient urgency, clearly aware that the master of the house had mobilized his resources. I sat by the frost-covered window, watching the heavy snow bury the sweeping driveway, terrified that my mother's deepest fears were currently being printed across the financial pages of the morning papers. Late the following afternoon, the grand entryway doors finally swung open. I was standing near the base of the sweeping staircase when Julian walked in, shaking the snow from his dark overcoat. He was not alone. Walking a half-step behind him was Bennett Cross, Julian's primary legal counsel. Bennett was a man composed entirely of sharp angles and cold logic, possessing the detached efficiency of a surgical scalpel. He carried a slim, locked leather briefcase and offered me a polite, deferential nod as he stepped into the warmth of the hall. Julian gestured toward the kitchen, leading the way. The shattered glass had long been cleared by Martha, and a fresh fire was roaring in the massive brick firebox, casting a warm, flickering amber light across the brushed steel and marble. Bennett unclasped his briefcase, the metallic snap echoing loudly in the quiet room. He did not speak of violence, nor did he mention any chaotic confrontations. He spoke entirely in the sterile, devastating language of corporate annihilation. The lawyer explained that Arthur Finch had signed a highly specific liquidation agreement containing strict clauses regarding the full disclosure of historical liabilities. By attempting to leverage hidden documentation for financial gain, Edward and Arthur had triggered a catastrophic breach of contract. A sealed, federal injunction had been executed at dawn. The Finch estate had not been visited by thugs or enforcers. It had been swarmed by forensic auditors, process servers, and federal marshals. Bennett detailed, with a terrifying lack of emotion, how they had completely frozen every phantom account, suspended the remaining trust stipends, and placed a draconian non-disclosure lien on both men. If Edward breathed a single word to the press, if he even attempted to discuss the Vance name in public, the suspended clauses would activate, immediately transferring his actions into the realm of federal extortion and corporate espionage. The threat of prison was no longer a vague possibility. It was a loaded weapon pointed directly at their heads, held entirely in Julian's steady hand. Then, Bennett reached into the leather briefcase. He withdrew a small, heavy stack of worn notebooks. The velvet covers were faded, the edges frayed from years of being hidden beneath dry floorboards. The deep emerald and navy blue fabric caught the amber light of the fire. Bennett placed the maternal diaries gently onto the pristine surface, bowed slightly to Julian, and quietly excused himself from the kitchen, leaving us completely alone. I stood frozen, staring at the physical remnants of my mother's life. I had expected them to be confiscated, cataloged as corporate evidence, locked away in a secure vault to protect the Vance empire from any future vulnerability. Julian did not walk toward the diaries. He stood on the opposite side of the island, the heat of the roaring open fire radiating behind him. He looked at the velvet books, and then he looked at me, his dark eyes stripping away the last of my lingering shame. He stated quietly that the bindings had not been forced. He assured me that not a single page had been opened, photographed, or read by anyone on his legal team. They had been seized purely as withheld collateral, and now they were being returned to their rightful owner. Before I could process the magnitude of his respect, Julian reached into the breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket, He withdrew a thick, folded document, heavily stamped with red legal seals. I recognized the heavy parchment immediately. It was the original promissory note. It was the exact financial contract Arthur Finch had signed in his smoky study. The piece of paper that had traded my life, my agency, and my future to satisfy a massive debt. Julian walked slowly toward the roaring stone hearth. He did not hesitate. He did not look back to ensure I was watching. He simply extended his hand and dropped the heavy parchment directly into the center of the flames. I gasped, my hands flying to my mouth as the thick paper instantly caught fire. The edges curled and blackened, the red wax seals melting into the burning wood, the sharp black ink vanishing into white smoke. The document that defined my worth, the contract that made me a piece of corporate property, disintegrated into weightless ash before my eyes. Julian turned away from the fire. He walked back to the stone workspace, picked up the fragile velvet-bound diaries, and stepped directly into my personal space. The scent of winter air, wood smoke, and cedar wood surrounded me. He reached out, gently prying my trembling hands away from my face, and placed my mother's notebooks directly into my palms. I clutched them to my chest, the soft velvet absorbing the rapid, frantic beating of my heart. Tears finally spilled over my lashes, hot and unbidden, sliding down my cheeks as the sheer weight of what he had just done crashed over me. He had not just protected his company. He had permanently severed the chains my family had wrapped around my throat. He had destroyed his own leverage to ensure I knew I was no longer a captive. I looked up at his stoic, trauma-walled face, my voice breaking as I whispered that I did not know how to repay a debt of this magnitude, that the financial loss of burning the original note was impossible to calculate. Julian reached out, his warm, calloused thumb gently brushing away a tear that had fallen near my jawline. His touch was incredibly light, a stark contrast to the ruthless power he had just wielded to tear my abusers down. The customary guarded intensity in his eyes melted into something profoundly vulnerable, something that looked entirely like surrender. "This is how you pay me back," he whispered, his rich, resonant voice vibrating in the quiet space between us. He told me to stop looking at the ashes. He told me to stop waiting for the invoice. He simply asked me to hold the pieces of my past that mattered, and to finally recognize that in this house, I was not collateral. I was home. The weeks following the destruction of the promissory note were defined by a profound, cautious thawing. The heavy, invisible chain that had tethered my throat to my father-run ledger was permanently gone, turned into nothing more than weightless ash in the kitchen hearth. I no longer baked out of a frantic, desperate need to escape my reality. I baked because the Vance's estate was finally, undeniably my own. The cold, sterile marble of the massive house began to absorb the ambient warmth of the daily fires, the rich scent of roasting cinnamon, and the quiet, steady rhythm of my footsteps. Julian did not suddenly transform into a boisterous, overly affectionate man. His nature was built of winter stone and quiet observation, and he remained fiercely protective of our shared silence. But the absolute rigidness of his corporate armor began to crack in small, devastatingly tender ways. He no longer ate his breakfast alone in the formal dining room. Instead, he would carry his encrypted tablets into the kitchen, sitting on the opposite side of the cool countertop while I kneaded dough. He would drink the sharp, bitter ginger tea I brewed for him, reading complex financial reports on his glowing screen, while the soft hum of the refrigeration units filled the space between us. He didn't demand conversation, and he didn't require me to entertain him. It was a domestic intimacy built entirely on mutual presence, proving that true safety did not require constant validation. It simply required the right person to share the quiet. The ultimate test of this newly established peace arrived in the bitter, freezing depths of late January. Vance Holdings was scheduled to host its annual corporate charity gala, a sprawling, high society event held in a massive glass and steel venue in the heart of the city. Historically, Julian navigated these functions entirely alone, moving through the predatory waters of corporate elites as a solitary, untouchable apex predator. When the embossed invitation arrived, I fully expected him to leave me behind in the protective isolation of the East Wing. I braced myself for the familiar sting of being hidden away, an instinct honed by years of Arthur Finch deciding when I was presentable enough to serve his interests. But Julian did not leave me behind. He did not for my attendance as a contractual obligation, nor did he issue a cold directive. I returned to my bedroom one afternoon to find a large, matte black garment box resting on the edge of the mattress. Inside, carefully folded beneath layers of crisp white tissue paper, was a beautifully understated, midnight blue silk gown. It was entirely devoid of the ostentatious, heavy beating my father used to force me to wear. It was elegant fluid, and fiercely dignified. Resting on top of the silk was a small, heavy cardstock note, bearing Julian's sharp, precise handwriting. It did not contain a demand. It simply read that a true partner does not stand in the shadows, and asked me to walk with him. That evening, the drive into the city felt entirely different from the terrifying, silent journey that had first brought me to his coastal fortress. The interior of the dark sedan still smelled of rich leather and crisp winter air, but the paralyzing tension had evaporated. I did not clutch my purse like a shield. I sat comfortably beside him, watching the blurred city lights reflect against the rain-slicked windows, feeling the steady, reassuring heat radiating from his large frame. The charity gala was a suffocating luxury display of clinical, calculated luxury. The air inside the towering venue was thick with the scent of expensive, overpowering perfumes that burned the back of my throat, the sharp clinking of crystal champagne flutes, and the low, calculating hum of people who measured human worth strictly in profit margins. Women wore diamonds heavy enough to cause bruising, and men spoke in hushed, urgent tones about offshore accounts and hostile takeovers. It was a sterile, unforgiving environment, completely devoid of the warm, tactile reality I had built back at the estate. I stood by Julian's side, my hand resting lightly on the crook of his arm. He was an impenetrable wall of dark wool and quiet authority, effortlessly absorbing the judgmental stares and whispered speculations of his peers. He did not introduce me as a recent acquisition or a finalized contract. He introduced me simply and firmly as his wife, effectively shutting down the thinly veiled curiosity of the corporate vultures circling us. Then, the fragile, ordered peace of the evening was violently pierced by a deeply familiar, desperate presence. I felt the atmospheric shift before I actually saw them. The heavy, chaotic energy of my past cut directly through the refined elegance of the ballroom, setting my nerves on edge. Arthur and Edward Finch had somehow managed to bypass the outer security perimeters. They had likely leveraged the very last, fading remnants of our family name, calling in obsolete favors just to gain entry to the one room where the city's wealth was concentrated. They looked entirely out of place among the pristine elite. My father's tuxedo was noticeably dated and slightly rumpled, his face pale and drawn with the hollow exhaustion of a man who had finally run out of lies. My brother, however, practically vibrated with a frantic, cornered malice. His eyes darted around the room, with the erratic intensity of a starving animal, looking for a weakness to exploit. The federal injunction had legally stripped them of their wealth, frozen their phantom accounts, and neutralized their extortion, but it had not stripped Edward of his blinding toxic entitlement. He still believed the world owed him an empire, and he was furious that I was standing in the center of one. They moved aggressively through the crowd, heading in a straight, uncompromising line toward us. Whispers began to ripple through the surrounding guests as the ruined debtors approached the billionaire, who had so ruthlessly liquidated their legacy. I felt my chest tighten instantly, the old, deeply ingrained instinct to shrink, to apologize, to absorb their public shame began pulling at my muscles. My breathing turned shallow. I prepared myself for the shouting, for the grand, melodramatic confrontation that had defined my entire childhood, bracing for the inevitable moment when Arthur would try to drag me back down into his sinking ship. Edward stopped just a few feet away, a venomous sneer twisting his features. He clearly did not care about the elite audience watching them. In fact, he intended to weaponize the crowd. He thrived on the chaotic destruction of boundaries, raising his voice just enough to ensure the surrounding circle of corporate titans could hear every syllable. He pointed a trembling finger at me. He accused me of orchestrating their financial downfall from the shadows. He spat the words gold digger and manipulator with venomous clarity, weaving a desperate public narrative that I had used my mother's legacy to poison Julian against them. He claimed that I was nothing but a transactional parasite, a deceitful daughter who had eagerly traded her own blood to secure a place in the Vance fortune. I stood frozen under the blinding chandeliers, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. I waited for Arthur to join the attack, waiting for the humiliating spectacle to reach its peak. Julian Vance did not raise his voice. He did not step forward to physically intimidate my brother, nor did he dignify the frantic accusations with a defensive argument. He remained terrifyingly motionless, his large hand gently covering mine where it rested on his arm, anchoring me to the present. His silence was not passive. It was a heavy, suffocating weapon. The entire ballroom seemed to hold its collective breath, the ambient noise of the gala dying away into an absolute, ringing quiet as the older billionaire fixed his piercing, inscrutable focus directly on my father. "Arthur," Julian said, his commanding timbre cutting through the sterile air with absolute, chilling precision. "You are trespassing." My father opened his mouth, stammering, desperately trying to muster the arrogant bluster of a patriarch defending his honor. But Julian did not allow him to speak a single word. Reaching into the inner breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket, the liquidator withdrew a single, crisply folded sheet of heavy legal paper. He did not hand it to Edward. He extended it toward Arthur, holding it suspended in the tense, silent space between us. Arthur's trembling fingers reached out and took the document. As his bloodshot eyes scanned the sharp black text, all the remaining color drained from his weathered face, leaving him looking like a ghost in a borrowed suit. "That is the final corporate dissolution agreement," Julian explained quietly, his tone devoid of anger, ensuring every society guest in our immediate vicinity heard the exact terms of their ruin. As of 3 minutes ago, when my legal counsel filed the final motion, the Finch Holding Company officially ceased to exist on paper. Your remaining shell subsidiaries have been absorbed. Your final desperate credit lines are permanently closed. You no longer possess the capital, the social standing, or the legal right to occupy this venue. Edward lunged forward to look over our father's shoulder, his face twisting in a mask of horrified disbelief. The realization crashing over them was absolute. They had come to this gala to publicly shame me, hoping to use the resulting scandal to force Julian into a quiet settlement to save his own reputation. Instead, Julian had delivered the final, fatal blow to their legacy without breaking a sweat or raising his voice. "Clara is not a subsidiary," Julian continued, his voice dropping to a low, glacial register that sent a shiver down my spine. "She is not a bargaining chip, and she is certainly not a target for your pathetic attempts at public extortion. She is my sole partner, and you are officially obsolete." He did not call for the venue's security. He simply did not need to. The sheer, overwhelming force of his legal and financial annihilation left my abusers entirely powerless, stripped naked in front of the very society they had tried to manipulate. Arthur dropped the heavy legal paper onto the pristine floor. Without a single word of rebuttal, the broken man turned and stumbled toward the venue's exit, dragging a furiously muttering, defeated Edward behind him. The crowd of elites parted silently, stepping back as if avoiding a contagion, watching the ghosts of a dead empire fade out into the freezing city night. Julian did not watch them leave. He turned back to me, the glacial, terrifying corporate mask vanishing instantly, replaced by a dark gaze that softened with profound, quiet care. He did not gloat over his victory. He did not demand my gratitude for defending my honor. He simply leaned down slightly, the faint scent of cedarwood washing over me, and asked if I wanted to go home. And for the very first time in my entire life, that specific word did not fill me with a sense of dread. The days following the charity gala brought a profound, unshakable peace to the coastal estate. The last frayed threads of the Finch legacy had been permanently severed, leaving me completely free to write the rest of my own story. I knew I did not want to live solely in the shadow of Julian's massive corporate empire. I needed to build something of my own, something tangible, warm, and rooted in the earth. While exploring the sprawling, rugged grounds of the Vance estate, I had discovered an old, unused stone outbuilding perched near the edge of the coastal cliffs. It had once been a groundskeeper's cottage, its walls lined with heavy timber, and its large, salt-stained windows overlooking the gray, churning ocean. It was a beautiful, forgotten shell just waiting to be filled with life. I approached Julian in the library one evening and asked if I could use the space to open a small, private bakery and tea room. I expected him to simply write a blank check or immediately hire a massive team of luxury contractors to transform the cottage into a sterile, modern commercial facility. He did neither. Julian understood the deep psychological necessity for me to build my sanctuary with my own hands. He understood that healing required physical labor, not just financial investment. The transformation of the old stone cottage became our shared daily ritual. During the quiet daylight hours, I scrubbed the ancient stone floors on my hands and knees, the cold water turning my knuckles red as I washed decades of neglected grime. I repaired the heavy wooden counters with coarse sandpaper, breathing in the sharp, clean scent of raw pine, and painted the interior walls a soft, welcoming shade of white. I poured my energy into the physical environment, treating every restored plank of wood and every polished pane of glass as a personal victory over the chaos of my past. And in the late evenings, long after the financial markets had closed and the city's corporate wars had paused, the ruthless corporate liquidator would arrive at the cottage. He would take off his expensive suit jacket, roll the crisp sleeves of his white shirt past his elbows, and work silently beside me. The ultimate defining moment of our quiet rebuilding occurred during the installation of the main oven. I had sourced a massive, vintage, cast-iron baking oven. It was entirely impractical for a modern billionaire's estate, lacking any digital interfaces or sleek efficiency. But it was absolutely perfect for the slow, methodical, traditional baking of artisan breads. It was also incredibly heavy, a colossal beast of dark metal that required sheer brute physical strength to align perfectly with the cottage's old stone chimney ventilation. I stood back, wiping a thick smudge of flour and plaster dust from my cheek with the back of my hand, watching as Julian maneuvered the heavy iron into place. He did not summon the estate staff, nor did he ask his private security detail to do the heavy lifting. He braced his broad shoulders against the freezing metal, the heavy muscles in his back straining visibly beneath his casual linen shirt. His jaw was clenched in quiet concentration, his boots planted firmly on the uneven stone as he applied a steady, grounding force to slide the massive unit across the floor. When the heavy iron oven finally slid into its proper housing, securing against the chimney with a loud, satisfying metallic thud, he stepped back and exhaled a long, heavy breath. His large hands were covered in black soot. A stark, bright white streak of baking flour stained the tailored sleeve of his shirt, and a layer of fine dust clung to his dark hair. This was a man who owned entire high-rises in the financial district, a man whose pristine tailored suits were a recognized symbol of his untouchable power. Yet here he was, willingly covered in the messy, chaotic, physical evidence of ordinary domestic labor. He turned to look at me across the small, dusty room, and for the very first time since the day he had arrived in my father's smoky study to collect a ruinous debt, Julian Vance smiled. It was not a sharp, corporate smirk. It was not a calculated display of confidence. It was a slow, genuinely warm smile that reached the corners of his dark eyes, completely softening the harsh, trauma-walled lines of his face. He looked down at the flour, ruining his expensive sleeve, then at the small, cozy space suites we had carved out of the cold stone together, and he seemed perfectly, profoundly at peace. "It needs a name," he said quietly, his deep voice carrying easily over the sound of the ocean wind rattling the window panes. He walked over to the wooden counter, where my bubbling glass jar of lavender sourdough starter was safely resting, tapping the glass lightly with a soot-stained finger. I looked around the small tea room. The air inside the cottage already smelled faintly of dried rosemary, raw timber, and the crisp, salty breeze blowing in from the Pacific. It was a space built entirely on self-authorized choice, completely devoid of legal contracts, financial ledgers, or leverage. I walked toward him, closing the physical distance between us, and reached out to gently brush the dark soot from his knuckles with my thumb. "It doesn't need a name," I replied softly, my voice steady and completely unburdened by the ghosts of the past. I looked up into the dark eyes of the man who had bought my freedom by burning his own power. He had shielded me with his absolute silence. He had fought my ugliest battles with cold, terrifying precision in the public eye, and then he had come home to kneel in the dust, simply to help me build my own safe walls. Not because I was a liquid asset, not because I was a contractual obligation, but because he had recognized my true worth at a time when I had absolutely none. People spend their entire lives searching for the right coordinates, the right building, the right title on a piece of paper to make them feel safe. I whispered, stepping forward and leaning into the solid, unyielding warmth of his chest. But I learned that sometimes love doesn't knock, it waits. It watches you heal in the quiet rooms, and it hands you the tools to build your own walls. Julian wrapped his strong, heavy arms around me, pulling me flush against his heart. The familiar, deeply comforting blend of pine needles, wood smoke, and frost wrapped around me, anchoring me entirely to the present moment. He rested his chin gently on the top of my head, breathing in the scent of lavender and warm yeast that always clung to my hair. Home isn't a place or a name, I murmured into the quiet stillness of the room, feeling the steady, rhythmic beat of his heart against my cheek as the ocean storm raged harmlessly outside our window. It's a person. If this quiet story found a safe harbor in your evening, please leave a like and subscribe to sit with us again.